Well, good afternoon for those of you on the East Coast. I think we're talking to folks on every time zone, including our guests who are in the roundtable today. They're calling and participating from almost every time zone. So thank you everyone for joining us for our roundtable. We're honored to take part in this year's Out and Equal Workplace Summit and to engage a handful of inspiring and intersectional thought leaders. I'm Bob Wittick. I'm the founder and president of Wittick Communications in Washington, D.C. In recent years, we've witnessed a frightening and unacceptable rise in expressions and acts of hate aimed at many populations. According to the FBI's own recognized undercounting, last year the nation reported over 10,528 victims of hate and bias crimes. That's not the number of crimes, that's the number of victims. And these were criminal acts that targeted LGBT people, but also aimed at people because of their gender or gender identity, their religious beliefs, their disability, and because of the color of their skin, their race, their ethnicity, and ancestry. However, with the rise and spread of COVID, we've been alarmed to see an accelerating rate of attacks and physical harm, especially to people who identify as Asian or Pacific Island backgrounds. And as with all records of these actions and crimes of bias, we know they are undercounted, they're underreported, and often unknown to the public. That's one of the reasons we wanted to host a roundtable today, because given these trends, we have a lot at stake here and around the world to confront this ugly climate and to identify real solutions. Before I introduce our full roundtable, however, let's open with a special guest and an introductory dialogue led by our colleague Apurva Gandhi, Senior Vice President of Marriott International for Multicultural Affairs, Social Impact, and Business Councils. Apurva has long been a trusted LGBTQ+ ally, and he serves on the board of Out and Equal Workplace Advocates. Apurva's introductory dialogue begins with our friend, our leader, our activist ally, Judy Shepard, co-founder of the Matthew Shepard Foundation and mother of the late Matthew Shepard.
Well, thanks so much, Bob, for that introduction.
Thanks, Bob. Thank you, Bob. Hey, Apurva.
Hey, Judy. Ms. Shepard, greetings and welcome. It's you're no stranger at all to each of us and to our audience. And for the moment, speaking for our leadership at Marriott International, we are just so proud and honored to know you and Dennis and to work with you and serve as a corporate sponsor of the Matthew Shepard Foundation. Your work and example means a great deal to all of us, and we're just so honored to know you and Dennis so well.
Thank you, Apurva. We're very grateful for your support. Thank you.
Thank you. And let me begin by observing, it will be 23 years next week on October 12th that you lost Matt to an ugly hate crime, and the nation grieved and still grieves with you. However, you and Dennis then dedicated the next decades truly to combating hate and crimes of bias with results, eventually resulting in President Obama signing into law the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Hate Crimes Prevention Act. What lasting impact do you think Matt's life, example, and passage of a federal law have had on our society?
Well, we finally got the federal government to acknowledge that the LGBTQ+ community is real people with real issues. I mean, they've been counting the hate crimes for years before, but never wanted to make it official, almost like we didn't exist. So this was the first time that protection for the gay community was enshrined in law, and rights were given to them, not taken away from them. So it was the first step to some really great things that happened in the Obama administration, and acknowledging the gay community as equal partners in this endeavor of our great experiment in America. So, it just woke people up, people talked, it was, and when we lost Matt, and it was such a media frenzy, actually, a lot of people in the straight community had no idea what was going on in the gay community because the media wouldn't talk about it in a positive light. So all kinds of awareness just happened, in that decade when we were waiting for a president who would recognize our issues.
Yeah. And I think if anything, the last few years have shown us that we have to keep at this, right?
Yes, definitely.
We have to keep at this, and you know, things can change, and we want to, you know, just, it's so amazing the work that you have, Dennis, have done that's had such lasting impact and will continue to, and I think we'll create a foundation that we can continue to grow upon. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Judy, I know you're very familiar with the mission of Out and Equal. You know, and in Out and Equal, we often try to see ourselves as a catalyst for equality and belonging, beginning in the workplace and of course throughout the world. We know intersections matter, since our work is really, it's not isolated in its own right. You know, we're not isolated from other marginalized people and communities. You know, you speak a lot to corporations, you know, people in the workplace. And when you do that, I know you address these intersectional audiences and concerns. What is your message? What is your message for allies and leaders from all communities?
Well, the message of the foundation has never been about the queer community exclusively. This is about everybody, all the marginalized communities. One thing I will add is I've spoken to several corporations this year where their employee resource groups are only 1 or 2 years old, which is astounding to me that they're just brand new and taking it on. But the message is we may be an ally for our own community, but what we really need to be is an ally for every community. We're all trying to achieve the same things, equality and equity in the workplace, but also in our personal lives. So, you know, we need to be paying attention to what the other ERGs are doing. And I'm sort of don't like that they all feel siloed. If there was a way to blend their discussions and do things for each other and together, that it would be a greater understanding for everybody. Years ago, I was working with a gentleman in the undocumented community, and he was gay. And he said, I'm trying to get my undocumented friends work with my gay friends so we can achieve, you know, the same set of goals to equality and equity. And so my gay friends were like, well, I don't really agree with undocumented workers. And the undocumented workers, well, we don't really agree with the queer community. So I just couldn't get them to get together. But that's largely out of ignorance. They just don't know what each other stand for and what they're working for. We just need to understand we're all working for the same thing. And we need, you know, intersectional participation, as well as recognizing that none of us are one thing. We're all multiple things. I would really like to see more like interaction between the employee resource groups themselves.
Yeah, there's a lot of strength when we work together on these matters, because it matters to everyone, right? We're all, right. It sounds cliche, but we are truly all in this together, right?
Yeah, we are.
And I think, you know, it's famous quote, no one is free until we all are, right? And all have the same equality, but also equity. You used those terms very well there. And I think it's so important. You know, Judy, you've seen the shocking and latest statistics on crimes of hate and bias. And I know you recognize all leaders, especially workplace leaders, face a tough climate that sometimes fosters hateful words and actions and can incite bias. Today, you know, in the subsequent discussion, we'd really like to address solutions that cross all identities. We'd love to hear from you what makes you hopeful, though. In your travels and appearances all over the globe, what can companies and employers do to help here?
Well, in my mind, it was corporations and who really set us on this path of equality when corporations recognized that the queer community was an entity that needed to be acknowledged, recognized, and listened to, that things began to turn around. When they started taking care of their workers with domestic partnership and benefits and things like that, that was a huge step forward, and also set an example for other folks, smaller businesses doing the same thing. It's the hate crime thing and the BLM protests. 2020 was like this inflection point, as the president keeps saying, of who we are as Americans. Who do we want to be? Do we want to be the people who single out and separate each other, or who care for each other? And when corporations started to step into the fray and say, we will not support those who are who exhibit racial bias or homophobia in their workplace, or who are not on the side of social justice, to me, that was just, it was amazing. And I wish we could hold their feet to the fire to make sure they're still going to do it. You know, they said it in the heat of the moment, right? Are they still doing it? I don't know. I really wish they would, because in the end, that's going to be what changes things. When employers start taking care of their employees in a way that proves they care about social justice at large. And in my experience, it's the younger people who are really looking for that. They're looking for a place to work where their supervisors and bosses and owners care about what happens to our nation, not just their company. That's a huge step forward. And I really wish everybody would join in and really stick to their pledge. I wish that would happen.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, Judy. And I think what we're seeing now, and even more so, let me break this down. I live with 3 Gen Z people in my house, and I hear this all the time. But I think as they grow up and start looking to work and find jobs and careers, they want to work somewhere where there's empathy, right? Where there's people who care about not just them in the workplace, but them in their homes and what they deal with between home and the workplace holistically. And I agree with you. I think what we're seeing are companies continuing to grow empathy for all the right reasons. And I think it has a lasting impact. And I truly want to thank you and Dennis, because your work has had a lasting impact and continues to grow. So thank you for everything you do, Judy.
Thank you, Apoorva. I'm going to leave you with a plea. The Equality Act is gathering dust in Congress, and we really need to get that through so that in all of the states in the union, employees are protected 100% in their jobs. It plays into hate crimes. If you live in a state where you can be fired for being gay, you're not going to report a hate crime. You might lose your job, and that is a double tragedy. So we really need to work in trying to make lawmakers see how important it is that they take care of us. This patchwork of laws for the gay community just is not sustainable.
Agreed. Thank you so much, Ms. Shepherd.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Have a good conference.
Thank you.
Judy, thank you. Judy must tend to the Shepherd Foundation Gala this weekend. I think we have Jean Marie back. We have most of us back. There we go. Hi, Jean Marie.
Hello.
Judy and Apoorva, thank you for setting the stage. I'd like to welcome all of our participants today. Let me make sure they're all here. Jean Marie Nevada, familiar face here at an Equal, Director of Learning and Inclusion.
Oh.
Yes, and everybody please mute if you're not a presenter. We would appreciate that very much. Jean Marie, thank you for coming back into the room. Vanessa Sheridan, I'm not sure that you've come back, but I hope you will.
I'm here.
There you are. And also, if Eric can help us by pinning us to the dialogue so that everybody can follow the bouncing lips moving when we're talking. Vanessa Sheridan is here, who serves as an author, corporate consultant, speaker about transgender issues in the workplace. And so we're very excited and grateful for your contributions. And finally, not least, is Deb Daggett, principal at Deb Daggett University. Deb is a nationally recognized leader, advocate, and expert on disability issues in the workplace and in life, in the community. One of the people I look to as my mentor on so many issues that relate to what makes us human. Deb, did you get back yet? I'm not sure that I see you yet.
Yes,
So
I
hope
am
you're
here.
There you are. Hi, Deb. I'm going to open with this fact, of course, and I think, Derek, if you can help us reassemble the group in the middle, that would be helpful if that's possible.
You bet, I'm on it.
Okay, you're on it. Thank you. I'm going to open up with this fact so we can keep going. If Marvel Comics had a team of superheroes dedicated as champions for equality, inclusion, and fairness, I think it would look exactly like these 4. I want to inspire your best examples in thinking today. I'd like to prompt questions that some or all of you can answer, and hope you will volunteer. But to make it a dialogue, I want all of you to feel free to volunteer as you wish. First, let's observe the climate. Jean Marie, what's the evidence that this pandemic has fostered incidents of hate and bias? In your work with PFLAG, what are you facing today? And you're meeting with many corporations across the United States, I think.
Yeah, and thank you, Bob, for having me here. Unfortunately, the data is our evidence. You can look at federal hate crimes data and see that we have seen increases across the board, and that this has been really consistent. And for those of us working in the queer space, we know how much pressure and how many threats, especially our trans and non-binary loved ones, especially those of color, are. But it's not just that. I mean, we can look at data around youth. The Trevor Project has some really amazing but tragic data telling us things like during the pandemic, trans and non-binary youth are 3 times more likely to feel unsafe in the home in which they have had to live than their cis and straight counterparts. The UN reported that the leaders of 12 countries squarely blamed LGBTQ people for the global pandemic. There are over 140 anti-trans pieces of legislation out there, some of which have already passed. And they're not just about trans youth directly in participation, but some of them are in Tennessee banning even mentioning LGBTQ people in curriculum, or giving people parents an out if they don't want their kids to hear that. And Judy just talked about it. Look at where we are with the Equality Act. And I can honestly say that anecdotally, while we have picked up more speed when it comes to talking to people and educating, especially in workplaces because of the pandemic, because I think going online has just enabled so much, on those moments that we are seeing pushback, it is a different pushback than I have seen in about 15 years of work. And I am sometimes seeing pushback that I can tell you is direct, verbatim language from our opposition. And it's being used very openly by some people. And that is an incredibly chilling experience. And I think, to me, it is a reminder that we are more visible than ever, but it does not equate to safety. It does not equate to security, and it certainly has not equated to equality.
That's very sobering and very clear what the evidence tells us, Jean Marie. I want to ask Apoorva a bit too, because of the work you do across diverse communities. You very much are talking to Asian American Pacific Islanders in light of pandemic issues, but in terms of their feelings of safety and security today. What are you finding?
Yeah, it's really scary. I agree with what Jean Marie is saying. It's scary, and it's taken on this new level of scariness, like the words, the actions, the freeness of which people feel comfortable to do things and say things and act certain ways against people. It's just, it's horrible. And I think what we've seen in certain communities, look, when you have people in the middle of a pandemic, when people are really stressed out for a number of reasons, when the economy is having a hard time, people are having a hard time making ends meet, history has shown people tend to blame certain groups of people, whether they are immigrants or minority groups, more than others. History has shown that. We've seen horrible examples in the past of immigrant groups being singled out as to blame for other people's economic or job woes or diseases and pandemics. And it's very scary. And look, and you saw some of that with the Asian hate crimes that happened earlier this year. And remember, this is only now as this stuff gets seeing the light of day, right? This stuff has been going on, but now because everyone has cell phones and everything, a lot more, you're seeing it more. So you're seeing either hate crimes against people that are being blamed, or sometimes hate crimes against people who people view as, well, they're doing better than I am. We can't have that. So I need to put some people in their place. And it's very scary. There's a famous quote, I'm going to get it wrong, but when, a certain piece of America gets a cold, other people die, right? And that shows you a bit of the impact that we're seeing on certain demographic groups, minorities, where, they may not have access to the same resources, they may not have access to the same opportunities as others. And during a pandemic, and when jobs go away, sometimes bigotry re-arises in horrible ways. And I think that's what we're seeing here.
Thank you. I just want to mention something. We have a very, very engaged audience. And in fact, many of them are commenting and adding observations to echo or add on to what you're saying. So I was going to say thank you for all of you who are paying close attention to both subject matter and also offering expertise and insight that I think benefit all of us. So thank you for that. I want to talk about visibility and invisibility, because we often do when we talk about intersections. And I want to talk to our friend Deb Daggett, who's taken part in Pass Out and Equal Summits and always bring fresh insights on intersections, particularly about people living with disabilities. I want to add a kudo to Deb, because she's a pioneer who has helped disability in to model their own disability equality index to benchmark best practices for corporations that's similar to the HRC corporate equality index. To me, that's a huge sea change because companies then have a very objective standard by which they judge whether they're actually applying policies and practices of equity to their candidates who they hire and to their employees who are living with disabilities. It's a very momentous, a historic step that's been taken. So thank you for that. But I want to ask about the COVID pandemic, and you're seeing intersectional challenges that employers are facing. For people with disabilities, what forms of bias and hostility cause so great concern?
Thank you, Bob, and thank you for serving on the DEI Advisory Council with me since its inception. Your insights have been so helpful. So a lot of people don't consider it a hate crime, but when people refuse to wear a mask or social distance or get vaccinated, it actually is a form of bias and not valuing people, both a form of ageism and ableism. Because when we wear a mask or we get vaccinated, it's really about protecting other people. And from the get-go with the pandemic, we have seen people say that, they don't want to have to engage in these guidelines from the CDC and other agencies. And if you are a person with a so-called underlying health condition, this can be really terrifying. So my 3 children, my husband and I, my mother, in our household, we've even found that when we need someone to come in to make a repair or to deliver something, that we experience outright hostility and anger at the suggestion someone should either wear a mask or pull it up so it covers their nose and mouth. It's not just on the airlines, it's in everyday aspects of your life. And it's scary, like you have to ask yourself, which is scarier, some form of violence because you asked, or being exposed to the virus. The other thing that's been happening is for people who need access to hospitals and doctors, with COVID taking up all of the resources in many communities, people with a condition like mine, I have a brittle bones condition that also affects the soft tissue in my body. So if I have a fracture or a bowel blockage or something that requires that I get emergency treatment, I may not even be able to get in the hospital for treatment. There are literally millions of people that find themselves in that situation. And once we get into the hospital, will we encounter someone who understands our condition, and will we be okay without our advocate? Now, it's hard enough if you are in a heterosexual relationship, but if you are a gay couple, it was already hard to get access to advocate for your loved one. Well, now they are overriding the Americans with Disabilities Act, whether they should be allowed to or not, healthcare power of attorney, and many other regulations to leave people by themselves without an advocate in an understaffed ER or hospital setting, without the ability to feel like their life is going to be valued if they're considered a person with a disability. So I could go on, but you get the general picture. And none of this is counted as a hate crime, but it most certainly is.
I think that is so powerful. And I have to say, you may not be aware, but our audience has been, if they could be put on speakers, you would have heard the roof raised. Because there was a lot of understanding and empathy for exactly the circumstances. We all, whether or not we're a member of the the community of people living with disabilities, we all are friends, family, colleagues, co-workers, and to us to create a climate that's safe and healthy is everyone's job. And so you've reminded us of very, very specific examples. Deb, one other thing I want you to cover that would be so useful for us. We're going through extraordinary climate change. Climate change itself, like the pandemic, imposes costs and challenges for society. But in doing that, with wildfires, hurricanes, and heat periods, they treat all of us alike. But the response to them is deeply unequal. And you mentioned that although these are not hate crimes per se, these episodes, they exacerbate patterns of ignorance and bias that exclude people with disabilities in emergency response and evacuation. So a COVID surge itself leaves all of us living with impaired health, but with a climate crisis or disaster, give us a little sense of what you're seeing about on that.
Thank you. Well, it is really, truly terrifying how many people have found themselves affected by a wildfire, a hurricane, an earthquake, any number of climatic changes of proportions we have not seen before. And FEMA and NGOs like the Red Cross, many organizations simply do not have protocols and are not set up to include people with disabilities, whether that's in an evacuation or where they're going to go to be safe. Even extreme heat. Many people with a broad range of disabilities are not able to tolerate extreme heat or extreme cold. And often these warming and cooling centers are not accessible and don't have any form of personal assistance. Sadly, many people with disabilities sadly have perished after, being terrified that that might happen because they lost power that was necessary for their oxygen or other life-saving measures. They found themselves unable to get life-saving medications, and they've been totally humiliated and disrespected by being put on the hardwood floor of a gymnasium without the resources to have someone help them do something as simple as go to the restroom. And so unfortunately, this has been an all too often case. And what's really sad is it's not even reported in the media very often. It's like it's a non-issue. For companies who want to do something about this, the World Institute on Disability, led by Marcy Roth, has a global effort where companies can contribute to disaster relief policies and practices that specifically are targeted to individuals with disabilities. So I would encourage you to look into that as an opportunity to do something about this. And of course, the last thing I want to say about this is intersectionally, people of color, the LGBTQ plus community, immigrants, individuals from minority faiths who are also individuals with disabilities are doubly impacted because they tend to be in communities that are more affected by climate change, and due to healthcare disparities, they're more likely to be a person with a disability and or be caring for individuals with disabilities who they don't want to leave. And so they may be in harm's way because they don't want to abandon their loved ones. And they too are perishing or suffering mightily because we don't have these resources in place. And given that according to the CDC, 25% of the US population is living with a disability, this is a majority minority. It just is unfathomable that we find ourselves in this situation. So sorry for my soapbox, but thank you for the opportunity.
You give a lot of lived truth to these stories and also remind us that these times demand a certain solidarity of response, and corporations play a huge role in responding to these issues in terms of resources, strategic thinking, protecting vulnerable populations, supplying supply lines. Basically, we're discovering supply lines are extremely fragile, and companies that have the gift and the knowledge to help reconnect us or make all the difference, they save lives. I want to turn, before we get into a lot more intersectional conversation, our dear friend, Vanessa Sheridan, we certainly welcome your unique expertise and experience about employees safety when they bring their gender identities or their non-binary identities to the job. And yet too often they still face those climates of hostility. What would you explain to employers, and what do you teach employers about workplace climate that makes less visible employees feel included, safe, and productive? What tools and solutions come top of mind?
Do we have another hour? Because I
Yes,
could probably
we'll
spend
have
that
6
time
weeks for
talking
this
about
course, yeah.
all of them. Let me just say a couple of things here. Over the last year, I've been doing some work with a school district in the Chicago area. And we have been working with them to help raise awareness on behalf of their LGBTQ employees and educators who work for that school district. And one of the things that we did over the last year was do a series of interviews and then a survey of the employees, asking them some, as a blind survey, and we were asking some pretty in-depth questions about the climate and the culture there. And you were mentioning safety a moment ago. And what we found out was that 49% of the people who responded to our survey said they did not feel safe, either physically or psychologically at work. And this is a school district. So the issue of safety is very, very real. And so in response to your questions here, what I'd like to do is maybe take a solutions-based approach and just offer a few solutions that I like to offer to organizations when I work with them. For example, I encourage them to make sure that they encourage and support an ERG for LGBTQ plus employees and allies. There needs to be a safe space for discussion and conversation and for raising questions and concerns and for experiencing community support in general. So an ERG is really important. Another thing would be to ensure that you have LGBTQ statements of inclusion that are specifically added to mission statements and to recruitment literature and to employee policies and to service literature. People of every gender identity, whatever it may be, need to understand, know that they're working in a safe and respectful environment. And that's really critical. And third, I really can't stress this enough. I encourage organizations to schedule professional staff development trainings on LGBTQ identities and on creating safe and inclusive workplaces for all employees, and to make those trainings mandatory, not voluntary. I think that's really critical. Education on these issues is vital. And today's most successful organizations, are taking this stuff really seriously. And maybe that's one of the reasons why they're today's most successful organizations. And then finally, one of the things I always like to suggest to organizations from a solutions-based approach here again is something that I wrote about in my last book, and I call it the 5 fundamentals for a gender authentic workplace. And those 5 fundamentals, just very, very quickly, are making sure you have LGBTQ plus inclusive EEO policies and procedures and best practices within the organization. Secondly, make sure you have gender non-specific dress codes, and an approach to workplace attire that's as non-gender specific as possible in order to give latitude to people so that they can dress in a way that they feel comfortable with in terms of expressing their gender identity. Thirdly, make sure you have trans-specific healthcare benefits in your organization. That's really critical for folks who are transgender, because we need access to things like hormones and psychotherapy and surgeries, and those need to be covered, under insurance policies. Fourthly, I encourage organizations to provide support for the gender realignment process, or transitioning, if you want to call it that, including, employee trainings and perhaps a gender support team and other support mechanisms like that. And then lastly, making sure that there's full access to accommodations and facilities for all employees, including restrooms and locker rooms and things like that, so that people can use those facilities in alignment with their gender identity as they know it to be. So those are the 5 fundamentals very quickly for a gender authentic workplace. And again, these are solutions-based approaches. And I hope that some of this is making sense and that people recognize the validity of what we're trying to do here.
Vanessa, I think many of the corporate representatives here, most of their companies probably have part of that agenda, but many of them, of course, are trying to learn, the new opportunities and creative ways to respond to new issues. But one thing I want to ask you, I think I saw a comment about it in chat, was the notion of sometimes a company is based in a community that's far more conservative than the company itself. And so they're dealing with a little bit of challenge in terms of community values or community perceptions that may be different and way off from the employer. Have you dealt with any examples of that where the company's well advanced from the community that surrounds it?
Yeah, I think there's certainly, some pushback that does occur from time to time in those kinds of situations. And all you can really do is present people with the facts and educate them to the best of your ability and let them know that these are the expectations in the workplace. Whatever goes on out in the community, we obviously don't have any control over to any significant degree. But in the workplace, we can set specific expectations, specifically around behaviors. We can't, control people's beliefs, but we can certainly control behaviors. And that needs to be the focus, in those kinds of situations, I believe.
Thank you, Vanessa. Purva, I want to ask about corporate policies, because a lot of companies indicate or talk about they're very strict or sometimes zero tolerance policies for their own associates that stem disrespectful, hateful behaviors. Do those kinds of policies, are they universal? Do they work?
I mean, well, look, does a zero tolerance policy work every time? I think we all know the answer to that question. No, they don't work all the time, but are they needed? You bet. What's the flip side of this? You're going to work for a company that tolerates this stuff? No. I mean, and what does it say to an employee who says, well, yeah, I work for a company that, you know what, it's okay. It's okay if someone discriminates or makes some comment. So you got to have this stuff, and you have to want to have these things. It's part of the culture. Look, I'll speak for my company, Marriott. We talk about putting people first. We talk about respect for the individual, and that means putting all people first. And that's part of our culture. If people have a problem with DEI work, they have a problem with our culture. And then that's a whole nother conversation I'm happy to have with them, right? So it fundamentally comes down to corporations need to want to have these policies. And look, is it going to stop everything every time around the globe? No, but you got to have it. You have to want to have it. And here's the other thing I'll say is sometimes by not speaking, you're saying a lot. When you don't speak, you say a lot. And I'll give you an example. On Bob and Jean Marie, you were there. 2015 PFLAG Straight for Equality Gala. Our beloved late CEO, Arnie Sorensen, got up on stage, changed the game, and spoke out clearly, explicitly against the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. He did not mince any words. I think the key words I remember was calling it idiocy and madness, if I remember, right? But think about that, speaking out, that sent a message to everyone, not just our LGBTQ friends, but allies in the audience. It sent a message to every employee, definitely at Marriott International, and probably a lot of other places, to say, hey, look, we do not stand for this. We're putting everyone on notice. We have expectations, especially in the hospitality business, for heaven's sake, where we want to welcome all. So I would encourage folks, I know we represent a lot of businesses here and a lot of people, encourage your leaders to speak out. Because right now, especially now, silence says a lot. And it says a lot to your corporations, to your customers, but also your employees are a key stakeholder, and they nowadays, like I said, I've lived with 3 Gen Z people in my own household. They want to work for a corporation that they believe in, and they believe that their leaders are standing up for what's right. Because if they don't feel that, they'll go work somewhere else. And for folks who are working in a corporation, if they don't feel like they're supported, here's a question: are they going to really do their best work? No, we know the answer to this. So those are my views on this. I think you got to have these policies, and you have to have leaders. Leaders got to lead. They got to speak out.
Apurva, there was a time where, especially even when Arnie or others spoke out, the press sometimes went after them a bit. They scolded them by talking about it being a big risk. And so the risk calculations, very interesting. Let me pose this to all of you, because I think you've opened up a great conversation that we all think about when we think about our leaders, our bosses, our CEOs. Do you all think, or that business got it about right when businesses responded to, say, the Pulse killings or to the rise of Black Lives Matter protests? Do you think corporations truly articulated enough share of voice during those events? Could they have done more? What do you think? Jean Marie, you look quizzical.
Deeds, not words. I think that everyone had a statement, or a lot of people had statements, and that went a long way. I mean, what happened with Pulse was terrifying on a number of levels, and it had an impact on a number of different parts of our community in really profound ways. But I think as I look back on it, we've now got 5 years since it happened. And I have to look and say, of all those places that did the thoughts and prayers kind of stuff, which ones of them have also invested in changing their workforces, changing their climate, changing their communities, and supporting the work that needs to happen to do that? And I'll just be perfectly blunt, it takes money too. So who has put funding behind these things and are showing it? And I think that's really important. I think it queued people up. But I think just like we're going to look at what happened with Black Lives Matter, will people sustain the commitments that they made? And that remains to be seen.
So voice is the starting point, not the end point, for sure. Vanessa, I'm sorry, you wanted to add?
No, I was just going to say, I totally agree with Jean Marie. I remember 5 years ago, right after the Pulse shooting, Jean Marie and I were both in Chicago, and we attended a vigil for the Pulse shooting together. And companies and corporations were making all kinds of statements of support and all that stuff. And the same thing happened after the George Floyd killing and the Black Lives Matter, protests and all of that. And we heard all kinds of eloquent statements from all kinds of organizations. And all I can think about right now is, okay, where are those organizations now, and what are they doing? What kind of difference are they making? Talk is cheap, Jean Marie said it, deeds, not words. And that's what I'm looking for.
Deb, before you went out on your own as a consultant, you were certainly a corporate executive too. What happens inside of a company when they have these conversations? Is there anxiety and talk about risk, or what do you find happens inside the conversation?
I think it depends on where they are on the maturity curve. My former employer, Merck, or an organization like Marriott that has had a sustained, steady effort in the diversity, equity, and inclusion work, tends to really look at everything foundational to see if they're doing enough and they can up their game, and are always looking at ways to improve. But when people are first getting started, they chase bright, shiny objects, whether they are things that will make them look good or things to avoid making them look bad. And when they're in that phase, if they don't get out of that, it can last forever. And you have to have the work going on no matter what's going on in the world, and do it if you're doing it for your employees first and foremost, it will translate, as Apurva is much more eloquent than saying than I am, it will translate into the customer experience, the guest experience. But if you don't put your employees at the center, so that they're always feeling that you have their back, that you want them to be treated with dignity, equity, and bring their whole lived experience to work. If that's not real, then you're going to see this constant chasing whatever the latest thing in the news cycle is.
And, I'll add to that, Deb, I think you're spot on. We all know the companies that just show up during Pride Month. We know who they are, right? We know the companies only show up during February on Black History Month, or right now it's National Disability Employment Awareness. We know the ones who just show up at the party when it's easy and fun and get the little check, and then you don't hear from them for another 11 months. I think the key thing is to understand what are the corporations that have policies and are in the community and doing things 12 months a year, right? Who show up to events, who participate, who get on the phone and cry when things happen in the community, and then reassure and have empathy towards their employees and towards their guests, and then back it up with metrics and measurable behaviors. I think people know the difference, and I think that's what you're seeing a lot more, especially with the millennials and Gen Z, is that that's what they look for as a place that they want to work and add value to. And of course, when people feel good, they're going to do great work for customers.
Jean Marie, I think of you often as probably one of our most familiar and respected educators in corporate workplaces. So you were talking to multiple generations at the same time. What are you learning about that? I think, in fact, Purva is our best channel to Gen Z today because of his kids. But
there's a reason why I'm bald, Bob. There's a reason why I'm bald. Let me tell you.
Exactly. But when you're facing generational conversations, what are you hearing?
I think that they're very interesting. I think the tolerance of the youngest generations in the workplace for I'll just be blunt, being pandered to is zero. They see through it so quickly. There is an expectation of action. The minute that they start hearing the thoughts and prayers language, you can actually see people begin shutting down, and they are savvy about it. They are willing to go someplace else, take their talents elsewhere and bring their talents elsewhere. And I think that that is something that we need to grapple with, the fact that they are going to push harder and they are already pushing harder. And I think that's tremendous. Having said that, it is certainly rocking the boat for a lot of people. I think that many people say it feels very aggressive and we need to understand corporate culture. But I think somewhere in the middle of this is our answer, which is we need to push harder, but we also need to understand what the landscape looks like that we are entering. But I think they are doing tremendous work, and it's really exciting to be alongside of them. And they're the people who, one of us will say, well, you just can't do that right now. And they'll say, why? And then you have to answer why. And when you're answering why, suddenly you realize there's no reason why not.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Jimmy, I think what we've seen in society, especially with younger generations, is that it's moved from high expectations to zero tolerance.
Yes.
That's what it is. And
Love that.
Agree.
Yeah.
That's very powerful, what you both have added there. I'm going to give you each a little grandstanding, but what I was going to do is invite anybody to ask any questions at the very end, just so we have some response or reaction. But today, are you hopeful that we are really changing attitudes and we are lessening fear, hate, and bias in our workplaces community? What makes you hopeful today? I'll start with Deb.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh.
I do feel hopeful. I feel hopeful because I am seeing EBRGs collaborating with each other more than used to be. It used to be not uncommon for those grassroots teams to compete with one another. And I love seeing that people are not only showing up at each other's events, but are coming together to plan joint efforts. And when one community is particularly impacted, the others getting more involved. Honestly, leadership changes a lot and can be fleeting. But if at the grassroots you see that norm arising, I think it's a very, very good sign, and that gives me hope.
That is good. Vanessa, do you want to riff there? What makes you hopeful?
I think there are three things. Yeah, I think there are three things that give me hope. And I'd like to piggyback a little bit on what Deb just said, because I think she's spot on with that. I see increasing numbers of organizations that are working hard to make progress in terms of inclusion and raising awareness. And that makes me really happy. It also reminds me that we have a long way to go. And that's why I love the work that Jean Marie does and that Deb is doing, and so many of our friends and colleagues are doing right now. The second piece is that I think society is slowly learning and becoming more educated about the realities of LGBTQ+ lives. And because that's true, that means we can have some hope, and we can, because when people become aware and become educated about these issues, all of a sudden the fear tends to dissipate and go away, and we can begin treating each other like regular human beings. What a concept, right? And then thirdly, the reason I'm hopeful is because of the young people. We've been talking about that, the millennials and Gen Z and the young people that are coming up. They fill me with hope. They are light years ahead of where I was at their age. And that just makes me so happy. Their acceptance of human difference without any pause, is just a wonderful thing. And I applaud it. And I feel like our future is going to be in good hands because these young people are just where it's at, and they're willing to learn and to grow and to be accepting and to help us all move forward. And I learned so much from them. So I'm hopeful for all those reasons.
Very good. Porva and then Jean Marie.
Yeah, I think what makes me optimistic is the notion is that I see more allies now speaking out on behalf of others who are not like them, right? It's important for men to speak out about women's professional development and the Me Too movement. It's important for everyone, I'm just seeing more and more of that, of people speaking out on behalf of others. That's really good to see.
Love that. And Jean Marie.
I think there are three things that make me hopeful. I think first is the volume of work that is happening. Under COVID, we were all very afraid that everything was going to come to a screeching halt, and actually the opposite happened. We have been busier than ever, and I think that is an incredible sign. I think the second thing is the content of the work that's happening. 10 years ago, we're talking to organizations who were just trying to do the LG 101, like that's how far we got. And now we are getting into so many more expansive identities, and people who are willing to listen when they call me and say, can you teach about pronouns? And I say, listen, this isn't about pronouns. This is a much bigger conversation you need to have. Let's talk about it. And they're willing to engage in that conversation. And the third thing I think is this push, and Apurva just said it, towards allyship, but a demand for truly active allyship, and understanding that just not doing harm is not allyship. Allyship must be a proactive action, and it is about doing things, and it's about consistently doing them, and that when people are not doing them, questioning why that's not happening. So allies are pulling other allies along with them. So it means less of a burden on, the marginalized communities that we are trying to actually support.
I'm reminded, thank you. That's very, very insightful, based on, I know, a lot of work you've done over many years, Jean Marie. When we began working in my work 26 years ago, when we were working with American Airlines, for example, ERGs were and BRGs were, fairly pioneering then. But one of the things that they took on, which I really admired, is they formed a diversity council of all their groups. So they did create that platform, but the two co-chairs at the start, the two co-chairs were the head of the LGBT group and the head of the Christian employee group. Because at the beginning, when I had first conversations, people kept saying things like the Christians and the gays. I said, well, those are not mutually exclusive populations. You have to understand, people of faith come from everywhere. It's the notion that intersections had to be invented. They don't. They're naturally occurring phenomena in life and in workplaces, that we are many things, we're many identities. And if we're only allowed to live through all of those identities, we can get past hate, and we can reduce instances of bias in our lives. And that's really what we're talking about today. Derek, I want to ask you, you're behind the scenes, but is there anybody we could who raised questions that would be helpful to put before these group of friends? If you're there, if you're there, Derek. Because we had quite a few comments in chat, and I thought there were so many that I'd be hard to come out with any that I would single out. But does anybody want to unmute themselves and ask a question to the group before we go? Something that's been bothering you from the moment we went on?
This is Lisa Martinez with Experian. I just had a
good.
question.
Thank you.
Yeah, for the panelists, a lot of you kind of hit on the fact that Gen Zers and millennials and the people who are all about the change right now would rather leave where they are than stay and initiate change. What would you say to those groups to get them to stay and try to instigate the change rather than just to leave for greener grass?
Very good. Did everybody hear that? Jean Marie, you're smiling big.
I'm a big stay and fight. I mean, nobody ever changed anything by running. I mean, not everybody is able to do that. Let's be clear. It is a privilege to be able to do this work. It requires certain supports in your life that not all of us have access to. And I recognize I'm incredibly privileged, but when we stay and fight and we can point to all of the work that has happened in other organizations because people said, I'm not going to leave, I'm going to get the policies changed, I'm going to get the practices changed. And that is exactly why we are at conferences like this one today. So I like to point to that and say, you know, there are times where I think you can say, all right, I'm done here, I've done what I can, but we need to be really fierce about staying and remembering that if you are capable of it, you are doing the work for some people who cannot do it right now.
I would add, Deb, that power and privilege are situational, not just where you sit on an org chart. You need to be honest with yourself about what kind of power and privilege you have, and are you spending it for your community in a way that demonstrates the courage of your convictions. I often worry that people who have the courage to leave also probably have the situational power and privilege to make change, and owning that is important.
Beautifully put. I mean, just really exquisite. Any other questions you'd like to raise? We have about another minute or so. I would like somebody invited to speak out or speak up or add a comment if you'd like. If you unmute yourself and just ask, we entertain that, that'd be fine.
Hi, folks. This is Michelle Sullivan. I'm with Merck in the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia. One of the concerns that I've always had, being an older person, it's very conservative around here. How do you balance the whole fear is the fact that somebody could actually hurt me for my beliefs? That's one of the challenges that I have. And I'm fairly well out there actually, but nonetheless, I still always have to be concerned. Inside my fence line and my plant site, I feel great. It's when I step outside into the surrounding communities of Elkton and such, where you see the Trump signs and all that sort of thing, and you see all the consternation that's going on now because Governor McAuliffe has mandated gender equality in the schools, but the people here in the Valley are going nuts over it.
You have raised such an important issue, and we could talk for the next 2 hours about that. Unfortunately, we have a lot of work to do in changing hearts and minds. And as far, you know, the only way I know of to do that is to educate people. And that's a process, not an event. And processes take time. I don't have a magic answer for you. I wish I did. Please be safe and, know that education is the key, and we have to find ways to educate people.
Michelle, I'm a fellow Virginian, and but I'm privileged to be cisgender living in Arlington. So I'm not in the Valley, where I know the culture and climate are very different. And actually, I've spoken to some of the folks in the campaign about speaking up and out for all people, especially with schools, because we're making tremendous legislative and political process in the state, but the communities are not following as fast as we need them. But we still need to be emboldened to have your back and your family's back and everyone else, because you all have the lived experience, not just the policy. So God love you for being there, and thank you for leading there, because that's where the work gets done.
Thank you very much.
I think that's going to bring us to a close. So I want to thank our roundtable. Great friends in life, great friends in work, great friends with a mission. And thank you for your contributions and intellects and passion, which show every day. So thank you. And everybody, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you.
Thanks, everybody.